It's Giles from Shape Blue. Welcome to our webinar. Thanks for taking the time to come and listen. We're today talking about Project Primate, which is the new user interface for Apache Cloudstack. Presenting today is me, excuse me a second, me, Giles, and Rohit, who's really led this project, certainly from a Shape Blue perspective. I'll be doing a few slides just to talk about some of the background of the project. Rohit is then the mainstay of this webinar today. Will be a demo and in terms of what we're going to cover. Just a bit of background. Some of this you've already seen in the blog I published a while ago, and we've sent out a couple of email updates. Just a quick look at why we need a new UI for Cloudstack, how it's being developed, the approach that's being used, what new features we've got, what's not supported, what potentially is missing from the new UI. Hopefully I'll get through that in 10-15 minutes. Rohit is then going to run the demo. Actually, Rohit, I know you're having a bit of audio problems. Do you want to just say hi to everybody before we go on?
Sure. Thank you, Giles. Hi, everyone. If you can hear me, thank you for joining the webinar. Back to you, Giles.
Thanks, Rohit. Great, thank you. Well, we can hear him. That's fantastic. We'll then just talk about the release plan and key dates for you to think about. Hopefully that'll all be done by about 22:30, the next hour, so leaving plenty of time for questions. Now, again, because I would much rather we just opened up the floor for questions, but we've got so many people on this. Can you all try and use the GoToWebinar question function? It looks like that on a Mac desktop or a Windows desktop. I think it looks slightly different if you're on an iPad or something. Fire those questions in as we're talking and demoing, and then we'll try and work through them all at the end of the webinar. Okay, so we've got a new UI, as you can probably figure out. I just wanted to go over, why this is important, and start with the current Cloudstack UI. This is the familiar face of Apache Cloudstack. It's been the face since late 2011. Personally, I think it certainly was quite a nice looking, strong design at the time. It's all handcrafted JavaScript. We've got lots and lots of hundreds of thousands of lines of code in there. It's served us well, but it is starting to date. In terms of the problems with that UI, the design is definitely dated. There's a certain sort of look that everybody expects especially from an administrative user interface these days, and whether it's good or bad, the current UI we have certainly doesn't have that look that people are familiar with for sort of admin tools to something like Cloudstack. It's got lots of niggles. The views are inconsistent, where you can search, where you can't search. Pagination is inconsistent. I guess everybody on this session knows what happens if you try and press back or press refresh with the current UI. These are things we just expect to be able to do in a UI these days. It's hard to upgrade. The current UI is part of the core Cloudstack packages. So little UI niggles are very difficult to patch, because we're actually having to patch effectively all of Apache Cloudstack. But really the biggest driver, apart from all of those other things, is it's just become increasingly difficult to maintain, develop and extend this user interface. We're getting to the point now where some features that are sort of UI heavy, 50% of the effort is actually going into the UI modifications instead of the stuff in the core management server behind the API. So, there was a point coming sooner or later where it would make sense to invest time, effort and energy into creating a new user interface. Now, Rohit was intimately involved in this from the beginning and started an R&D project roughly a year ago, a little more than a year ago. And the first thing he did was sort of work with a few people to sort of figure out, what are the requirements for a new user interface. Okay, so we want it to be clean, enterprise-like, intuitive to use, and importantly, intuitive to use for administrators and for end users, because the Cloudstack user interface covers both of those use cases. Going to that last point, we had the problem with the old UI. It's got to be easy to learn, develop, customize, extend, and maintain. Okay, we saw the old UI as this point of friction in terms of the ongoing development of Cloudstack, so we wanted to remove that friction. From a functionality viewpoint, to start with, any new UI should match what we've already got, obviously making it easier to develop on top of. We should separate the core management server code from the UI code to allow a different cadence of development, to allow easier updating, that sort of thing. And we should also look at API auto discovery. Those of you who use CloudMonkey are now familiar for the last few versions of CloudMonkey. CloudMonkey's gone and read the API from the management server, and if parameters and things have changed, it's automatically accommodating those. And really, in the 21st century, we should have a UI which is doing those sort of things as well. Some other things, role-based rendering of elements in the UI, as well as configuration. So, if somebody hasn't got permissions to do something, they shouldn't be seeing things. And at the moment, trying to do that sort of stuff in the current UI is handcrafting code to actually switch buttons on and off. Obviously, we want support for browser history. Want to make language translations dynamic so we don't have to reload everything if a language changes. And again, it's the 21st century, so we need to support desktops, tablets, mobiles, etc., etc. So Project Primate was kicked off about an hour ago. Started by Rohit, quickly got traction. Started as an R&D project, working up some initial ideas, making some technology choices, identifying those requirements we were talking about there. That then developed into a special interest group, a SIG within the Cloudstack community. This is a subset of the community who are all focused on creating a new UI. The first cut of that was presented at the Cloudstack conference last year in Las Vegas, which was in September, or maybe in October, excuse the dates. And then the Cloudstack community liked what it saw and took the decision to say, okay, we're going to adopt this. It's not ready yet at that stage. It wasn't ready at that stage, but we're going to adopt this as the new UI. And importantly, in order to do that, there had to be a decision to deprecate the old user interface. Obviously, we couldn't have two UIs which are, constantly in parallel development for the next few years. And I'm going to talk later after Rohit's done his demo about that timeline. Primate is there. You can find it on GitHub. The link's there. Been in development. I suppose this project sort of started about 12 months ago. So in terms of the design principles for Primate, from a development viewpoint, we wanted it to be using declarative programming, so we didn't have people coming in to actually hack lines of JavaScript to actually go and build entities and objects within the interface. Choose a modern framework methodology, not doing anything DIY. Obviously, the auto discovery I talked about earlier, generating widgets, views, behavior automatically based on the API. Data-driven behavior and support for browser configuration on local storage and that sort of thing. Basically, these are just things that we needed a modern UI. The group working on it at the time had a good look around at different technology choices. Obviously, there's plenty of JavaScript frameworks out there at the moment, and there's React, whatever it is you want to use. But the thing that stood out in terms of Vue was the ease of onboarding for new developers with Vue.js. So that was chosen. There were some other reasons for that choice, but pretty much any of the current frameworks would have done the job. But Vue gave advantages in terms of how easy it was to learn and get on board with. Also, Ant Design was chosen from a design framework viewpoint, which helps give us that very consistent look to views, consistent look to buttons and menus and that sort of thing. The key architectural points of Primate. First of all, Primate is a separate thing to the Cloudstack management server. It's It sits in a web server. It can sit in Cloudstack's web server, or it can sit in its own web server. It gets pointed at a Cloudstack API endpoint. So its code base lives separately. So most of you here can probably figure out the advantages of that. Gives us obviously a lot more flexibility in terms of upgrades, in terms of maintenance. We can do things like having multiple user interfaces point at one version of Apache Cloudstack. Obviously, the code and the configuration has been split. That's by using the Vue.js framework, which means, you know, it's a much easier onboarding process for people who want to do some customization, want to do some branding. And I know most of you listening to this have done those sort of things, or some integration. You're going to find that a lot easier than dealing with the treacle that is the current Cloudstack user interface. And we've got the API auto discovery, which lets us auto generate menu items widgets based on what Primate finds in the API at the time, which again is helping with ongoing maintenance. Also lets us do role-based access properly, etc., etc. So key new features. I suppose the headline here really, despite the fact there are a few bullet points here, is Primate doesn't really bring any new features. That's not the idea at this stage. At this stage, the idea of Primate is to give feature parity with the existing user interface. So to give a new, clean, easy to maintain, all those things we're talking about, environment or user interface, but not to actually make any significant changes to the functionality. There are a few changes. Obviously, things like consistency of views, paging and searching is all now much more consistent across the user interface. We've got proper context-sensitive help. It's URL driven. You can brand it more easily. It's multi-platform. All of those things come with the fact it's a new UI. But in terms of features, we're not looking to deploy a whole raft of new features with this project. This is about a new UI. There are some that will come as it gets released. The technical preview gets released with 4.14, and really these are new features of Cloudstack 4.14 as opposed to the new user interface. We've got the user interface elements of backup and recovery framework, the Kubernetes service, some other features there. They will all be in the existing UI as well, but they've also been migrated into Primate at the same time. So being pedantic, yes, there are some new features, but those new features aren't because there's a new UI. Those new features are because they were being put into Cloudstack anyway. In terms of what it won't have or hasn't got, I have a separate slide later about things left to do. From the point of tech preview, there are some new features, relatively minor features for most people, that will be in 4.14 that haven't made the cut to go into Primate. And that's just a timing thing because these two things are being released together. And there's one specific thing that hasn't made tech preview, which is management of network service providers. Again, that's just a timing thing because the tech preview release is imminent. Longer term, there are some things that may not be supported. And I say may not, I've underlined likely there. Regions, you can read these things here, the quota plugin, caching secondary storage for S3. These are all things that, to be frank, most people in the community think that nobody is actually using, and they're certainly not being maintained, actively maintained in the Cloudstack development community. I say likely not to be supported because this is open source, right? So if somebody says right now, no, we have to have regions, we rely on regions, then you know that can be incorporated into the new UI. But these are things that we were thinking are likely to be deprecated at some point anyway. Finally, there are in Cloudstack a whole bunch of specific pieces of integration that have been written at different times from various vendors who were getting involved in Cloudstack at different points. Again, most of these are not in use certainly widely. There may be a few organizations out there using them. They're certainly not being actively maintained. So the view was, well, do we need to bring all these things that we don't think are being used over into a new user interface? And the answer was, well, certainly not at the moment. But the thing to make really clear here, all of these things I'm saying likely not to be supported, they're not disappearing from the Cloudstack APIs. Yeah, these are not being deprecated from Apache Cloudstack. It's just the new user interface hasn't got the interface elements for these things. So, you know, Cloudstack still has that code base. It's still exposing those things on its API. Other things that aren't quite there and sort of are missing at the point of technical preview. A lot of work has gone into the translations, the language translations for different languages. And about 70% of the existing translation keys, the string files, have been migrated. So as long as there was a translation for the language you're interested in for that 70%, you should see that translated into your language of choice. That was done as a bulk exercise. I think each file has got something like 5,000 strings. So there's a lot of work to be, but the guys could only actually get about 70% of them, having to pattern match on the names of the keys and all sorts of things like that. So there's 30% roughly of those left need to be done manually. The translations also haven't been verified by somebody who speaks those languages. New functionality that's come in, new strings in Primate where it's got a new message, haven't yet been translated. And there's just a note there that, you know, the existing translation files varied in completeness. And just a note in terms of when the old UI was translated into different languages, this really was a community effort. This was, you know, back in the just post Citrix days of Cloudstack. It had just become an Apache project. And generally the translations got driven by users or people who are interested from different countries. The problem we have with the SIG, the special interest group around Primate, is they're overwhelmingly all English speakers, or rephrase that, they don't necessarily speak the languages of all the translations we have. So we're very much hoping there'll be some community effort to help with those translations if that's important for people going forward. Final note, user documentation. There is some admin documentation, how to deploy Primate, etc. The user documentation in its mainly will remain the same because the concepts, the ideas, the terminology is all the same as the existing UI, but the look of that documentation changes with the screenshots, etc. That has not been done for the technical preview stage. That's a task to be done between tech preview and general release. To install Primate, you need officially a version of Cloudstack which is 4.13.1 or 4.14, both of which are due to be imminently released. Just a side note on that, just to check before somebody says that, well, hold on, there's a conflict there with the fact it's got auto API discovery and you're saying a particular version. There was a legacy bug in Cloudstack which had been around forever, which meant it didn't return results. If you asked for results like a list of VMs in pages, it basically ignored that and didn't return the pages correctly. So you can actually point Primate at an older installation of Cloudstack and it should work. It hasn't been tested against any older installations. And everybody knows that the page sizes will be a little bit wonky. So don't recommend that. There is a workaround if somebody really insists on doing it. It needs to sit on a web server. Vue.js can be pretty much served from any web server, or it can sit in the Cloudstack management server itself. And again, Vue.js supports pretty much every browser, anything that's ES5 compliant. So it should be pretty much anything that everybody's using nowadays. Okay, that's pretty much everything I want to say. So I'm now going to hand over to Rohit. If you are there, Rohit, are you here?
Hello everyone, I'm Rohit Yadav, software architect at ShapeBlue. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for joining the webinar. Let's jump right into the demo. Charles, can you also confirm if you can see my screen?
You're good, Rohit.
All right, thank you, Charles. So what you see here is is Primate running on Chrome on a Windows machine. We start with the login screen. So Primate, again, just like the old UI, is a single page app. Once it is served by a web server or by the management server, it's pretty much works or functions like a client, much like the old UI or like CloudMonkey. What we see here is the portal login. Let's say the UI Primate can also detect whether this specific environment has the single sign-on enabled or not. For the agendas of demo, we'll first log in as the root admin user because the root admin has access to all features in CloudStack. So we'll look at major features, layouts, and everything that we can go through. Then we'll go through a separate kind of login as a read-only admin just to demonstrate the role-based capability of Primate. Then, if we have time, we'll try to log in as a normal user or as a single signed-on user. Let me log in as the root admin. First thing we notice is as soon as we log in and the login is successful, we'll see the message that says discovering feature. This is where it does API auto discovery to find out list of all the APIs that the logged in user is allowed to execute. Based on that list, we rendered parts of the UI, things like navigation, if you can see on the left hand side, and other details that we'll go through. The first thing we see is the general layout. We wanted to keep Primate easy to use, so anyone who's used to the old UI should be able to simply jump into Primate and start using it without much training. If you see on the left-hand side, there's a navigation bar. We can actually hide that navigation bar as well. There's the logo on the top. We start with the dashboard page by default when we log in. The dashboard you see on the right side is the admin dashboard. Here, much like the old UI, we can see statistics for a specific zone. We can, in fact, if we have multiple zones, we can go through that list and we can check statistics for a specific zone. In very larger environments, there might be multiple zones, so this list is actually searchable. So if I need to search, I can start typing and I can do this. What we see here is the normal statistics that you would normally expect, things like memory, CPU storages, VLAN, CPU cores, things like that. There's also a refresh button, which you can use to refresh the screen. On the right side of this view, the rightmost side, you'll see a list of events that have happened since the last time I've logged in, and we show the top 5 or 6 events that are specific to that account who has logged in, and it is shown in a timeline format, so one could even look into that. If let's say somebody wants to go and view alerts or view events, they can click on these buttons, and it will go to this specific view. Now, let's go back to the left-hand side of the page for a bit. Let's go back to the dashboard. On the left side, we can see there are sections, and those sections, when you click, they kind of open up, and I can see for the compute section, what are the different things I can access. Same goes with storage, network, images, which is your templates and ISOs, infrastructure. So navigation can be very quick. You don't have to go to one view and then select another view. The other thing you may have seen on the top side is we have this button that allows you to collapse the navigation view, which is actually useful when your screen size is small. Let me show you the adaptive capability of Primate. If I restore the size of or change the size of my browser, you can see the UI automatically adapted to that screen. So we have built Primate ground up to look beautiful and to adapt very well depending on the size of the screen, whether it is in tablet mode or so this is your tablet mode. The one you saw before was your mobile phone mode. And if I kind of maximize, you can see this is your desktop mode. On the top side, you can see there is this big large button that allows me to change the project. So and this also is searchable. So if I have multiple projects, I can basically search for a project and I can click on that project. On the rightmost side of the top bar, I can see there is a translation menu, there is a notification menu, and there is the admin or user menu through which I can either log out, I can get some help, I can go to my profile. Let me start by showing you dynamic translations. So prior to, I think in the old UI, you're only allowed to change translations before you log in. In Primate, translations are done on the fly. So let's say by default you get English. Let's say we switch to, I think this is Japanese. So as soon as I click this, you see on the navigation bar things have already changed. It didn't require refreshing the UI. Let me try another one. Let's try French. So as soon as I click on the French language, then the navigation menu will kind of remember that I've selected this language, and the language will be rendered dynamically. Let's go back to English. The next button will basically show you notification. We'll see a demo shortly. On the right side, we have the user menu. If I click on profile, it will directly navigate to the user view or user page. So I see in under what user I got logged in, and here I'm shown my API key and secret key. I can click on these buttons to copy. Let me go back and start again from the instances point of view. That's sort of one of the first few things that users tend to do. So I click on instances. On the right side, you see a familiar page where you see a breadcrumb, you see the instances, there's a refresh button, there's a search bar, and there are some buttons to perform some action. In case of the instances navigation, the plus button would allow me to add the instance, and the search box will allow me to search any resources. So let's say if I search for something like my own name and I hit enter, I should see list of all the VMs with some pagination that match the search string. Let me check that back and go back to the previous view. You'll notice that this is a table, and this table has these pagination at the bottom. So of all the items that are being rendered, we don't have infinite scrolling, but we have deterministic pagination in Primate now. So you have an ability to change page size. You also have ability to go between pages. And if there are many items, for example, let's go to events, for example, there might be thousands of events in a system, and having infinite scrolling doesn't make sense for such a view. So here I can jump to a specific page. I can change the page size also if I want to see more than, let's say, 10 items. And I can also specify a specific page. Let's say we go to page number 100. Now let's go back to the compute page, but instead of using clicking compute and clicking on instances, notice the URL. The URL has a hash key or string, and then afterward there is some string. If I now with Primate, I can use browser-based navigation, so I can use backwards and forward button in the browser, and if I hold it long enough, I can see what are the different pages I've viewed. And if I let's say if I click on dashboard, it will remember and it will I think I clicked the wrong one, but yeah, dashboard, then it will go to the dashboard. And same goes with forward button as well. So I can go to event. Let's go to the instances page and look at the table view. So here we have a table. We got some names. We have some states. This thing is sortable, so you can click on this sort by string or integer value. Notice there are some strings which are in blue color. Those are clickable links. So one thing we have done in Primate is we have introduced contextual navigation and mapped some views with the string. For example, if I know there is a zone and I want to find more detail about the zone, and wherever I see this blue link, I can simply click on this and it will navigate to the specific view. So in this case, the use case could be I was looking into some items in a table and I wanted to know about a specific resource or entity like a zone or a domain and an account. I can click on that. It will take me to this specific page which is specific to a zone. I can find some details about that zone. Let's actually go and look into what is being rendered in this view. On the top bar, we start with the breadcrumb that shows our location or position in the UI. There's again a refresh button, which I can use to refresh the specific resource, in this case, the zone. On the right side, there are a bunch of buttons. These are actions I can perform as an admin or as a logged in user on this resource. For example, I can edit, I can manage HA and out of band, I can, let's say, add VMware data center to this. This is a form. When I clicked on the action, you may sometimes be presented with a form, or it may route or it may navigate to some other view depending on the use case. In most cases, when I click on a button, it should show a pop-up or a form to take inputs or ask for confirmation. Here we can see a typical form which starts with a heading. I can of course close this form. Let's get it back. And then the inputs that are mandatory will have this red asterisk. We have introduced this information button. The information you see, if I move my mouse on the I button, there'll be a pop-up that tells me what that parameter is. This information is taken from auto-discovered API and the description which may be defined in for that specific API. Previously, if one would want to know about description of a parameter, they would use API docs to know. So those you sort of get actions and also dynamic API discovery as well, the description from those discovered APIs. I can put my details here and I can press OK and it will try to perform that action. Let's actually go back to compute and start with a compute, an existing running VM, and let's try to perform some actions on this. Let's go with this VM, for example. All right, so we got a bunch of actions here. I'll just show you an example of stopping an instance. So let's stop this instance. One thing you may notice that may be slightly different from the previous action form was it does have this I button that tells me information about what force could mean. There's also a question mark button that's next to the wizard name or the form action name. If I click on this, it will basically open contextual documentation, and these are all configurable. So an admin, let's say if they maintain their own knowledge base or their own, let's say a help website, they can configure and put in specific links to specific actions. And if those are available, we'll see this kind of a question mark button. When clicked, it will open that help document. So in this case, I'm stopping a VM, so I get a documentation link that I've opened in a new tab that tells me something about stopping and starting VM. Let's go ahead and just stop this VM. So the VM got stopped and the view also got refreshed. And I've got a notification as well that says stop instance. It got successful. You can see as soon as I performed an action, the resource got updated and the status was previously running and the status now has been changed to stop. Let's now look at, we have looked at the breadcrumb and the action. Let's look at the two cards that we see. Let me hide the navigation bar. On the left side, you see this card-like widget, and on the right side, there's another card-like widget. The left side card widget is what we are internally calling the info card that shows you a glimpse of that resource in a quick and more, let's say, visual way. For example, I see this status and an icon to say whether it is stopped or not. I see a UID. It's a very common, let's say, use case for people to copy the UID. So we have given this barcode icon. If you click this, it will copy the UID to your clipboard. In case of a virtual machine, it can have some metrics data or statistics like CPU usage or the total CPU. So here we can see the total available CPU capacity and the usage. Here we can see the memory, the disk, the network, and different NICs that are added to that virtual machine. The default IP address, which will, I mean, list of IP addresses that belong to those NICs. I can also see compute offering template that was created on zone where this VM was deployed, account domain. Now this VM was stopped. If I let's try to start this. If I were to start this, I may even see some more metadata or quick glance information, things like where this VM might be running. So let's wait for this to start. Once the VM has started, on the info card on the left-hand side, I may see a few other details. For example, the host where the VM may be running. And all of these things, things like your network, compute offering, template, host, zone, those are all clickable links. So let's say if I need to check something, whether this host has some specific configuration or not, I can click on the host and it will navigate to this specific host. Again, those clickable links are only allowed or shown depending on your role. So a normal user may not see that, but let's say as a root admin, you would be able to see that. So here we are presented with a similar view. The name on the top, some labels here, the status of the host, ID, some metrics data of the host like CPU, memory, network, IP addresses, other things like cluster, pod, zone, even the management server. And let's actually go back and complete our description of the info card for the VM instance. So one thing is, of course, you can go back and forth. Of course, these clickable links you can also open in a new tab. So you don't have to use the same tab. You can, of course, open this in a new tab. If we scroll to the bottom, we have some navigation buttons. So here, let's say if I want to see what are the different volumes of this virtual machine, I can click on this and it will take me to a list view, basically a table, which will list all the volumes that are available to this or attached to this VM. Similarly, we have other buttons to view VM snapshots. For the backup and recovery feature, we can see backups. We can also see any affinity groups that were configured during, let's say, deployment of the VM. Next section we see is the tags. So I can put in a random key value tag. So let's say I say key one value one. I can save and it will save those key value tags. For specific resources, things like domain, host, and virtual machines, we have an annotation feature, or you can say some sort of way to comment. So I can put in a comment for my, let's say, my colleagues who may also have access to this VM and say, do not stop this. And I can mention that this was by me. Click on save. And so this was an existing feature that got implemented. I think it was introduced at least in 4.13. And we can put multiple comments. You can see a history of comments with their timestamp, like who added those notes. So that was the card on the left side. On the right side, we see another card that can show us details about that resource. In this case, a virtual machine, the description of various devices or the hardware of this virtual machine. For example, I can see disks and NICs, and they are collapsible. So I can see there's one disk and one NIC attached to this VM. I can also see that this is the root volume. I can see some metadata information. I can see some labels. I can also click on this. So if I click on the disk, it will go to the resource view or detail view of the specific resource. In this case, the volume, the root volume of the virtual machine. Here I see similar things. On the left side, the name and some icon, some label, the status and the ID, metadata about the VM, things like the size, the VM name where it is attached, as well as the size of, or sorry, the state of that virtual machine to which the root disk belongs. Other things like compute offering of that root disk, which basically is that of the VM, the template that was used, the primary storage where the volume exists, cluster, pod, and things like if I need to see snapshot of this volume or tags that are attached to this volume. On the right hand side, this for volume, the view is very simple. It's a basically list of details of the root disk, things like a name and ID, storage type, some metadata and statistics, path, for example. Let's click back and go back to our virtual machine. The next section in the hardware is the network adapter. So in this case, we can see what are the different NICs which are attached to the virtual machine. We can see information about those NICs. And again, just like virtual machine, the volume of the virtual machine, I can click on the specific NIC or the network attached to the virtual machine. It will take me to this a similar view of the network. Here I can see things like on the left hand side, the VLAN ID as a root admin, the status ID, the offering it was used, tags, and if I want to see instances that are on this network. On the right side, I see the details. So much like the volume or instance, so a detail tab. In addition, I can have additional tabs depending on the view. In this case, I can have egress rule for the isolated network. I can have a list of public IPs. I can even acquire IP. I can do other things like configure the firewall, port forwarding, load balancing rules. If I click on virtual routers, I'll see what are the different routers belonging to this network. Much like rest of the UI, I can click on this blue icon It will take me to this router. I can see metadata and clickable links that are related to this resource. Details on the right side. These are different buttons, action buttons that I can perform on the router. Let's actually go back to our, let's say, instances. Uh, let's go back to the instance. The next last sort of tab we see is the settings tab. So if I click on settings, I can see what are the different settings that are configured for the VM. It says, please stop the virtual machine to access settings. So it's similar to the feature it's on old UI where you are not allowed to change settings for a running VM. Let's stop this VM just to see what are the different things we can do in this tab. Notice as I'm performing any actions, I see these notifications. If I don't do anything to these notifications, they will go away in few seconds. Or I can click the cross button. And again, the notification button, if I see here, I can see what are the different things or actions I've done. I can, of course, clear them. Here, let's go and try to add a setting. So we'll select, let's say, a keyboard. And from the list of options, I can select, let's say, US, click on Add Settings, and I've got the new setting here. Much like a few things that we saw, like when I start the VM, there was this documentation icon. So if I click on this, it will open a admin define, or by default we get the links pointed to the Cloudstack documentation, but these links could be admin defined for their own knowledge base website. Similarly, we can also have those such buttons in the navigation itself. So if there is something that is general documentation on using a resource type, we might see this kind of a button. Let's go back to the instances view, the list view. Here also we see this kind of buttons. If I click on this, it will open the specific configured link for the specific view. One of the things we have done in Primate is to separate code from configuration, and this actually allows to users to or admins to configure that. Let me show you two more cases, and then we'll jump into some role-based uh, access. So here, let's just try to deploy an instance. So let's give it a name called test webinar. If there are multiple zones, I can scroll or I can search. Let's select the topmost zone. As a root admin, I can specify various options, but let's jump through the basic ones or the default ones. That is, we can select a template, we can select a compute offering, a network. While it loads, you can see on the right side, as you select options in the form, on the right side, you can see summary of your instances, like what you have selected so far. So let's say we have selected the template, let's select the compute offering, and we also get search bar, we also get navigation here. We can select various things, like say the affinity group. We have to select at least one network, or otherwise it takes the default network, and I simply say launch VM. And so this is one of those forms which were unlike a wizard driven. It's a more modern form where you get to see this. It's successful now. The VM has launched. We can, I think, go to the next page where we should find this. So we see there's the test webinar VM. It's already running. Let me show you a few last things, let's say interesting things around roles. So one of the things we can do is we can define a custom role. For purpose of this demo, I've already created a read-only admin. That means an admin that can only perform list related APIs like list, get, find, but cannot do anything else like to affect operation of a resource. And what we'll do is I'll quickly go through infrastructure to show you two things, and then we'll log in as a read-only admin and verify. So let's say as a host, when I click on host, host view, I see the table of host. I can see the add host button as well that allows me to add a specific host. If I go to a specific host, it will show me different actions I can perform for this host. Now I've created a read-only admin. Now we'll log out and log in as that read-only admin. and we will check whether that read-only admin is actually allowed to uh, do any operations or not. So again, as soon as we log in as the user, it will try to discover all the APIs that are allowed for the specific user, logged in user. And because we logged out from that context or URL, Primate will remember that, and it will try to, like, after you log in, it will redirect you to the same context. Here we can see there are different options, but the action buttons are gone. Like I can list and I can see, but I cannot see the action buttons on the right top side. If I go to the host view, for example, I don't see that add host button now. I'll see list of all the hosts, but I'm not able to see all those other things. Let me log out and maybe perform one last example of, let's say, login as a normal user. And again, let's say if we can either work with projects, or we can, uh, if we can work to, let's say, deploy a VM. So notice after I logged in, it tried to use the same kind of URL, and because the logged in user is not allowed, I cannot access that. Let me, I think more or less the forms and views, they are all consistent across different user types. We have looked in example of the root admin, the read-only admin, and normal user. Here we don't see, for example, the infrastructure tab, the navigation tab. Let me finally show you an example of, let's say, how do you install and consume this project. So for the purpose of that, I have a running Cloudstack environment that has 2 KVM hosts. And so you can see this is the old UI. And on the same path, I'm just trying to show you that Primate is not installed. Now what we will do is we'll simply SSH into the management server host. To keep the demo simple, I've used management server as my web server for serving Primate. Here what I've done is I've already downloaded the RPM. That RPM could be consumed directly as a file or by configuring the repository. So much like Cloudstack, it will be published and shipped like a dev and RPM repository. Here I can simulate a installation from a repository by calling yum local install. Let's say before I show that, let me show you that Primate is not installed. So I'll go to user share Cloudstack management web app. Here you see different folders, but we don't see any folder named Primate. So I can do yum local install, and I can give the RPM to that. And what the RPM does is it simply extracts the UI assets to a folder called Primate. So in user share Cloud Stack Management Web App, now we see there's a Primate directory. Here we go, and now if we simply go to our link and refresh, we should see the Primate UI. The beauty of this setup is it allows, at least for the technical preview, to install and host, let's say, both the old UI and the new UI, both being served by the management server. We also support cross login. That means, let's say, if you um, log in into Primate, and let's say if you go back to old UI and you refresh, you will also be logged into the old UI. So that allows users or admins to test Primate against the old UI, let's say on the same management server. So we are logged in as the admin for this environment. That pretty much, I think, covers the demo. Let me pass back to Giles.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rohit. That was a whistle-stop tour in 25 minutes. Hopefully everybody's got the idea of simplicity to install and sort of the usability of this new UI. Rohit, can you see my screen now you've handed me back?
Let me change the presenter.
Great. Okay, that's the demo done. Okay, I've just got a few more bits of information quickly. Just take me a couple of minutes and then we'll go over to questions. Key dates. So the technical preview of Primate, which is pretty much what you saw there, is going to ship with Cloudstack 4.14. Its release is imminent. It's in voting at the moment, so watch out for announcements in the next few days. At that point, the community will accept no new features in the old UI. So effectively, we're at a code freeze on the old UI, with the exception, obviously, of bugs, etc. We're aiming for general availability with what will be version 4.15. We call it Summer LTS, which, just to confuse people, will likely be in Q3 of this year. And then in the next LTS release, which will be the winter, I think that's a type. Yes, sorry, the winter 2020 release, which will more than likely be early in 2021. The old UI will be deprecated. Okay, so there's a bit of a window there for migration, but this has been something that the community have decided on, that as of the release early next year, the old UI will be deprecated and removed from the project. Things left to do once we're at technical preview, which will be very soon. There's obviously, it is only technical preview, so there's some polishing to do. There's feedback to come in from any bugs that have been found, etc. User documentation, translations, more work needs to be done on them. A few of the features I mentioned earlier from 4.14, which didn't make the cut, they need to be brought in before GA. And obviously any other new features that are developed in Cloudstack between 4.14 and the next release. After GA, it should just be new features, but we expect to still see some activity going on around translations, depending on uptake, etc. And then at the next release, Primate is effectively the Cloudstack UI. In terms of migration, we're predicting this should be relatively easy up to a point. So as Rohit sort of stressed there, we've decoupled the UI Primate from the management server. So you can run, certainly with 4.14, 4.15, you can run the old UI and the new UI in parallel. So you haven't got to do a big cutover with rollback plans and that sort of thing. The other good news is, from the small group who have been sort of testing and looking at Primate so far, the feedback is that admins who know Cloudstack, who are familiar with Cloudstack, don't really need any training on this. The concepts are there. They understand what a host is. They understand what a zone is, what a pod is, and they can just pick up this UI and run with it. However, I know a good number of you on this call do expose the Cloudstack UI to your users and your customers, whether they're internally in your organization or out if you're a public cloud provider. And obviously this does look significantly different from the old UI. So that's where we're seeing the work to be done around user familiarity. And I know a lot of you have got documentation you've developed, screenshots, etc., on top of the old UI. Obviously that's going to need to look a little bit different with the new UI. The other area to think about is any integration you've done directly into the UI, and any customization, two-factor authentication, any branding, textual changes you've done. Again, I know people on this call have done those things. Obviously, that's probably somewhere where you would want to focus your testing. So our recommended approach at the moment is get the technical preview when it ships, use that to evaluate, test, get to know it internally, give it to your admins. The caveat there is it is a technical preview, so don't point it at your live production environment at this stage. Realistically, it's relatively low risk, but we just couldn't say to actually point a technical preview at a live production environment. Feedback, any issues you find, we absolutely will help you do that as a supplier to you, or you can go straight into the community feedback. You might find a bug, you might recommend a design change, you might find something where it's difficult for you to change a piece of integration or something. Yeah, get that in at this stage before general availability is really the best time to be doing that. Then when it ships at GA later in the year, all of that's anything you found can be taken into account. If you're looking at this thinking, oh, we've got quite a lot of work to do on documentation, I see no reason why you couldn't start to update that now based on the tech preview. Obviously, there isn't the project itself doesn't have its own documentation, so you might be thinking, look, we're just going to lift bits of that because it's open source, so you might need to wait till further down the line for that. But there's nothing to stop you starting thinking about documentation now. With feedback, really important, people have a look at this in tech preview, give any feedback. There's the link to GitHub there on the right. The UI's also got a shortcut to the issues page of that little report bug feature at the bottom for either feature requests or for any bugs. I want to stress, if you don't want to do that, you don't want to get involved with giving feedback straight to the community, we, your service provider, will happily take that feedback and proxy into the community for you. We're involved in this project, as I'm sure you can guess, so we're happy to do that. Either route's good for us. And on the same note, anybody is also welcome to get involved in that project. We talked about translation earlier. There's some work to do there. Or if you, for example, have got an integration point you think would be, or some changes to support an integration point you think would be useful to other people, feel free to get involved and go and contribute that there. Again, we're happy to do that for you as ShapeBlue. So that's pretty much everything we wanted to cover. We're at 4 o'clock here already. We'll just go, we've got a few questions. We'll go through those. Because we're over time, I'll follow up with an email on any questions if anybody does need to drop off now. We'll go through these. Gregor has asked what languages are in most dire need of review. So it's a difficult one to answer, Gregor, because the translation files are exactly the same as they were already. The general rule is, if you're, and I know where you're based and I know the language you're using and I know that's okay for you at the moment, so that you can assume that translation file, that hasn't changed. The bit that will have changed is that the 30% of the keys of the strings that haven't been migrated over, they won't have come over, so that will require some attention. But that's not language specific, that's across all of the languages. Hopefully that answers your question. Rohit, can you see these questions?
Yes, Charles.
Could you pick up Mike's question about where it's going to be built and does it rely on Jetson?
Sure. Thank you, Charles. Mike has asked a question the question I'll briefly describe is whether the Primate UI is going to be built into the Jetty service or will that be a separate project? To answer Mike's question, Primate itself is a separate project. It will be built, shipped, and packaged as a separate thing. However, users will indeed have an option whether they want to use a separate web server like Apache or Nginx that you can configure in a reverse proxy mode to a, let's say, separately running management server endpoint. Or you can also, let's say, in the example we saw, we can ship it as a RPM where you can install it on the same management server. And management server can also serve as both as the API endpoint and also the web server that serves Primate. I think one of the comments he has said is we have it Dockerized out and it works fine. So I think that's also one of the preferred way where you can create Docker containers and use Primate as a Docker container.
Okay, while you're at it, Rohit, do you want to look at Nee's question around auto discovery there?
Sure. Nee has asked a couple of questions. So the first question is whether Primate will do auto discovery every time one logs in. That's correct. Because of the way Primate is written, right now it will do auto discovery every time someone logs in. We may, however, try to optimize, let's say, based on whether APIs were discovered past for the same user, for the same sort of management server. So we may look into improving that, but right now, it will indeed do auto discovery every time someone logs in. The dashboard, the second question he asked is, in the dashboard, if you have multiple zones, will that show us just the first by the list or will that show the cumulative overall status of all the zones? So to answer this question, I guess right now what we saw in the demo, if you have multiple zones, you can select a specific zone. The first in the list will be the zone that was let's say configured by the admin to show up first in the list. So In Primate and also in the old UI, there's an option where you can order the zone list, and based on that, the ordered list of zones, we'll pick the first one and show its own metrics. However, it will not show cumulative details. So what we saw in today's demo was not cumulative, it was for a specific zone. The next question is whether there's an option to customize thresholds and color. Right now we don't, but after the technical preview, we'll work on to customizing colors and theming. And we had a similar question from Adam on theming, which is there a dark theme from Primate? So one thing we have done is we are not using, or we haven't built Primate on a custom framework. We are using AndDesign. So we'll be limited by all the configuration options that AndDesign can help and support. And last time I checked, AndDesign can indeed like allow you to configure various colors through, let's say, a JSON-based config file or some configuration where you can specify different color for different parts or components in the UI. And there's also a documentation available online that can be used to do this. For the technical preview, we won't be supporting a lot of configuration option, including theming, but in future you can expect this to be supported. We got another question from Nee, which is about where the comments are stored. So in the demo, the annotation or commenting that you saw was part of Cloudstack. It's not part of Primate. We were simply leveraging some existing features. I'll pick one.
Rohit, do
Yeah,
you mind if
go
I
on,
just
Raj.
chip in on that one? Because I noticed that question from Nee.
Yes.
Where are the comments stored? Are they part of the API or just a feature of Primate? I think it's worth just sort of looking at the bigger picture to that question, which is none of this is just a part of Primate. Primate is just a UI on top of the API, right? And that's a really important concept. As I was trying to say earlier, none of this functionality is new functionality from Primate, comments, anything. It's basically just a wrapper, just a pretty wrapper for the Cloudstack API. And that's a pretty important point. Sorry, Rohit, back to you.
Sure. Thank you, Giles. Let me go to one more question, which is, do we support bulk actions, things like ability to select multiple VMs and start, stop them, or select multiple events and archive or delete them? Yes, indeed, we do support that. This will be supported in the technical preview, though we couldn't show this in the demo. We have a similar question on theming and customization of UI from Gregor. It's about whether there's any sort of customization available and how difficult would that be with Primate. It's still work in progress. It won't be available in technical preview, but normally we'll get some sort of a configuration file, let's say a YAML or JSON file, through which you can configure various options in Primate, things like name and branding and logo, including colors and theming options. So this we will target for GA. There's another question from Nee, which is, if you have multiple management servers, can I install Primate on a separate web server and point this to a load balanced IP? Yes, indeed, you can do that. You can run Primate being served by a container or let's say, a separate web server like Nginx and Apache, which can add like a reverse proxy to the API endpoint to any load balanced IP, or it could be a specific management server. I think there's one last question from Poonam, which was, can you show the zone addition screen? I think the question is about whether we support the ability to add a zone. I think yes, indeed, we do that. Showing that demo would have increased the time, so we skipped that. But indeed, we already have support for adding zone in Primate. I think that's all the question I could see. In case I missed, I'll pass it back to Giles.
Cool, thank you, Rohit. Okay, we'll wrap up shortly, guys. There are a few questions there that we haven't quite got to, and there's some that I don't think are necessarily relevant. What have you? If we haven't answered your question, ping me. We can set up a call or do it via email, and I'll try and summarize an email out to everybody about all of these questions. So thanks for taking the time to listen today. Please do get in touch if you want any more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.